London School of Economics is here in Kuala Lumpur, and you're watching a special episode of Agenda Awani. I'm very, very glad that I have a very distinguished professor with me, Professor Tim Besley from LSE. Professor Tim is the School Professor of Economics and Political Science at LSE, and he has held many positions, even in Oxford and Princeton. He has even worked in a committee that looks at interest rates, for example, in England. And I've sat in a session where a professor was giving a talk at the lunch session. So I'm going to extract some points out from there to share with you at home. First of all, welcome to be here, Professor. I guess if I were to coin it, a lot of people, experts especially, are looking at Asia and its rise economically especially, and wanting to chart and map out the secrets of it. However, the first thing that will strike anybody coming from out of Asia into Asia would be how diversified and very plural, whether it's religion, ethnicity, or even geography of Asia itself. So how would you start looking at the rise of Asia and trying to frame it into how you're going to look at it?
Well, you're right that it's dangerous at some level to categorize a whole geographic area and try and say there's one experience. As you say, there's a diversity of experience in Asia. But one thing you do tend to hear, in certain contexts at least, is particularly when one's looking at areas of the world that are less successful, particularly the emerging market world, they do tend to say, but in Asia there's been a measure of success. And in fact, it's not hard to see why. I mean, if you just look at indicators of economic growth, Asia has done consistently fairly well as a region. Yes. And obviously, again, there's diversity of experience. And so people want to say, well, what is it? What are the key things that Asia has got right? And there's certainly been some interesting policy success with respect to supporting economic growth, effectively developing infrastructure, encouraging the rule of law, trying to fight corruption, being open to the world in terms of trying to export and to produce goods that other places want to buy. There's a whole series of things that I would say, again, risky to generalize, that Asia has done well, and other places in the world are aware of that. The question is, though, why isn't that exportable to the rest of the world? I mean, if it's true that Asia has succeeded by and large, why is it that other places in the world simply can't copy? Yeah. And that raises a series of interesting issues about how you export knowledge and how you turn knowledge into action.
Professor, it's very interesting to see, especially if I look at the human capital behind the rise of Asia. A lot of them were trained in the West, in Europe and in America. They come back and they contributed towards the growth by, going into institutions and leading efforts to move the economy and the well-being of the people forward. So how do you look at institutionalized approach to development? Because one of the key points put out by you at the lunch session was, it's not that we don't know what we have to do to advance the economic well-being, but sometimes, maybe in my opinion, we just can't translate it into what we want it to be. For example, execution is always the pain, not in planning and policy, for example.
Yeah, and I think, well, obviously I agree with you. And I think what's interesting is when people have, even if they're educated abroad and they come back, they want to come back and contribute, I think, is the typical story. But nobody wants to be frustrated. So you could have the best educated population in the world, but if they don't have the opportunity to use those skills for either self-betterment or betterment of the people of their country, that's going to be no good. So it's not enough just to have educated people. You've got to have that those educated people are able to do or to use the benefits of that education. And I think that's where I would invoke what I discussed in my presentation earlier, which is that you need institutional frameworks that allow people to be successful, for people who are not successful to be held to account, either removed from office or disciplined if they're not successful. You need to have a system that works. It's not enough to have individuals who are well-intentioned and well-skilled, but the system as a whole has to work in a way to encourage them or to allow you to make the best of that population.
How crucial is it? I'm sure you've spoken to some of your former students, for example, who've come back to Asia, because many might be saying that, some of the things we learn and practice before in areas overseas can't just be transplanted back home, because we have to adjust it and we have to make it suitable for the environment that we are in. And that learning process, I think, is very, very key to distinguish what's the secret of Asia's success.
I agree with that. I mean, what we're not trying to do at the LSE or anywhere else where we educate people is to tell them there's one way. Countries have to, by a process of experimentation, find what works for them. And that may depend on the history, the culture, whatever it is about that country that makes it distinctive. And so what you need to do is to give people an enabling environment in which they feel they can express ideas and experiment. But equally, that if something is successful, it's scaled up and it's continued. If something is unsuccessful, it's stopped. So you need still to have an environment in which you get the benefits of that experimentation, and you learn the lessons, positive or negative lessons, in the system. And as I say, what I don't think we're doing when we're trying to educate people abroad who have intentions of coming back and resuming their lives in other parts of the world is to give them a recipe. What we're hoping is we give them a way of thinking, and that way of thinking is useful when they're looking for the solutions to any specific problem that they face. And I think good social science is a very useful set of tools for addressing certain kinds of challenges that societies face.
I like the good social science part, but before we go for the first break, the rise of Asia also have to be looked upon in the global context, because the financial architecture landscape of the world was not made when Asia was rising. It was when Asia was living in a different path, when it was still under the rule of the colonial powers, for example, Bretton Woods or whatever else. Malaysia hasn't gotten its independence. It's only in 1957, but Bretton Woods was coined in 1944. So with the rise of countries like China, and now we're looking at currency flows, we're looking at interest rates, for example, and hot funds going from one nation state to the other. So how do you look at the landscape, the global financial landscape, in terms of institution and also in terms of practice? So because if the dynamic is changing, then surely new governance and new sets of institutions governance need to come into play.
Yeah, well, you're raising a number of issues. At one level, there are issues around whether the global architecture that's still in place today is, in a sense, suitable for today's world. As you say, many of the institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, were created in a different era. And one could argue, indeed, I think it's a very credible point of view, that there hasn't been sufficient reform in the governance of those institutions to reflect modern realities. So there's that aspect of it, what you might call a purely global aspect. But there's also the aspect to the extent that the countries themselves have to respond to those challenges. So, for example, we know during the East Asian crisis of the 1990s, there were lessons learned, which did result in a number of institutional reforms undertaken unilaterally by countries that could see that they got particular vulnerabilities in their systems, and they needed to respond. And in many ways that was the consequence of opening up the economy, particularly financially, and becoming more open, at the same time as openness allows you to do many good things, to trade in people, in other words, get the best people to work, or trade in goods or capital. Equally, it brings a certain vulnerabilities which need to themselves be responded to. So it's important to have innovative institutional thinking to respond to whatever challenges are thrown up by the way the world is changing. We don't live in a static world.
Exactly.
We don't know where the next challenges would come, but we need to have the systems in place that allow us to be responsive to the challenges that come along.
Professor, I have to go to the first break, but once we are back, would like to maybe ask you to go back a bit in the past for the Asian economic crisis of 97-98, and because for the first time ever, especially in these parts of the world, we heard the term currency control, for example, and we were hearing debates even from learned people in economics and saying, hey, that's not going to work, are you crazy, you're going to kill your country economically. But more than a decade over that, and it has progressed, and now we're seeing some semblance of that being done. So if you can, share with us your views on that in 97-98 and come back and relate it to the present world, that we'll discuss after this short break. Hello, you're still watching a special recording of Agenda Awani at the LSE Asia Forum. I'm still with Professor Tim Besley of LSE, and Professor, I was just alluding to the fact that, about maybe 17 years ago in 97, the currency crisis that impacted and then became what is now known as a full-blown Asian economic crisis. How do you look at that? Because there's just one drastic action taken, which was currency control. And that helped set a lot of things when we were hearing a lot of views saying that we had this fundamental flaw here, and there's this different path that we've taken, that we should have taken the right way. We took the left road, for example. But with hindsight now, how do you look at that? Because I think that's one of the painful lessons learned for a country in Asia to move forward in the world.
I make 3 points really. Let me first make a general point about the way one could contribute to a debate like this as an economist. In many ways, when you're an economist involved in policy, there is some analogy between that and being a doctor dealing with a patient who has complex diseases. If a patient has a complex disease, in most circumstances, the question is not just which kind of treatment, there may be disagreement on that, but equally how intensively to make the treatment of a complex disease. And many of the economic problems we face, there is no clear-cut rule of thumb where we know the answer. And we can simply say, there's an off-the-shelf issue. Whenever you get to a situation in economics where someone tells you that they know the answer to complex questions, there may be simpler questions where we do know the answer, they know the answer to a complex question like currency management, then you need to start to worry quite a bit. And I think if you look at what came before the East Asian crisis, there was a very strong consensus that countries should dismantle capital controls, that they could never be justified. Now, I actually believe, and this comes to my second point, that the case for that was as much political as economic in the following sense, that people, if you're going to have some kind of managed currency regime, somebody's got to manage it. And in the end, that could be technocrats in a central bank, or more likely than not, it's going to involve politicians being involved in currency management. And you might be concerned that politicians are good at doing some things, but maybe that's not something they're good at doing. And therefore, you could be concerned about having a currency management regime. And I think a lot of economists who were trying to move towards more open and free-floating exchange rates without capital controls were doing so to a degree because they'd looked at what governments had tried to do in managing exchange rates. And they either believed they'd done it poorly, or they believed they couldn't do it, because in a true open world, governments typically lose pretty much all control over the exchange rate. So that's sort of my second point. And then the third point is, well, we learn from experience. And I think the East Asian crisis was a salutary experience. People drew different lessons. Not everybody said the lesson was to move back towards a more managed exchange rate regime. There are still many people out there who, for the reasons I just raised, are skeptical about that. But I think the intellectual case for some kinds of currency management is now, the burden of proof has now moved somewhat in favor of that. But those who believe that fundamentally it's about the dangers of political control of currencies will not have been moved very much. But I think it's an interesting example because it balances both economics and political considerations.
I have to go for the last break, but once we are back, so little time with such a great person. But I'm going to straight away jump after this. Where are we right now? Because there's a lot of divided opinions on where the global economy is. Some say that the worst is over, we're starting to see slow growth coming back. At the same time, some are saying, look, China is cooling off. So that's the hardest, biggest, hottest engine. And if it's cooling off, then that's a bit of a worry. So where's Europe now? Where's Asia now? How about America? And can we only talk about economics without looking at the political and social impact of things right now? Because in this converged 21st century, everything is sort of merged together. So I'm going to get Professor's views on that after this. It's not always that you have a London School of Economics professor around in Kuala Lumpur, but I have one in front of me now. Thank you so much, Professor Tim, for being here. But we have 5 minutes left, so I want to go straight to the fact that where is the global economy right now? Because there are a lot of issues, whether it's still recovering, whether it's still stuck in the doldrums where it was a few years ago, and then the conflicting reports of Europe is finally moving up again or it's stagnating. And then there's the question about America, whether the President Obama-led measures has already, we're seeing the fruits of it, and that's going to hold. And then there's Japan, and then there's the rest of Asia. So how do you look at the state of the global economy right now? And what do you see, especially for Asia, moving into the near future?
Well, you raised some very interesting issues, and there's a lot going on, and I'll try and offer one or two insights that may be of interest to your viewers. I mean, in a broader sense, we are still seeing in Europe the whole the consequences of the financial crisis of 2008 are still very much casting a shadow on things that are happening today, and that's because we still have issues in the banking sector. Varies by country, varies by bank. There's no simple rule of thumb. But of course, we also have the inherited fiscal situations that came alongside the fact that the economy in large parts of Europe, in most of Europe, turned down and created very difficult fiscal positions for governments. And the fact that the financial system is not yet fully recovered is, I think, partly weighing down on the growth prospects. Now, what's going to happen next is going to hinge a lot on the policy responses, because nothing is on all of the issues that you're talking about. Nothing is set in stone. It's not as if we have a future which is predestined. Yes. And that we're going to have that future regardless of what happens. So one thing that makes it quite hard to analyze the outlook is one is having to take a position on where world policy intervention is going to go. And in Europe right now, there's some question, for example, whether the European Central Bank is going to engage in some wider stimulus through quantitative easing. There's lots of complicated issues being a multi-country institution. So I don't want to speculate on whether that happens or not. More generally, you mentioned China and the slowdown in China. At some level, we always knew, and this was as true pre-crisis as it is now, that China would slow eventually. I mean, the kinds of rates of growth that China has been delivering are fairly unprecedented over long periods, and it's at some level it's no surprise. That said, of course, one of the vulnerabilities that is getting a great deal of discussion in China now is through the financial system, and whether China, in particular in the housing market, is going to have certain issues. That would be in many ways a bigger set of issues than just a broad slowdown that reflects a rebalancing of the Chinese economy towards consumption, which again over the medium term, I mean the investment rates in China are unprecedented. We would expect a slowdown in investment offset to a degree by an increase in consumption. So there are things we would be expecting to go on in China, and will have global implications. China is now a large enough economy. If you're sitting here in Malaysia, it's a very significant economy given your exposure to China. So there are things going on that are specific to China and aren't necessarily related to the global financial crisis. So there's a set of issues there. And then, as you say, in the US, tapering is creating a certain set of issues with as the US unwinds its emergency monetary policy measures, which will have global implications. Now, the question's going to be, as we see these situations evolve, they could evolve on the sort of upside of what we think or on the downside. Policymakers are going to be asked, as they were in the financial crisis, to respond. I mean, if things go well, it's easy for policymakers. They just can kind of unwind special measures or whatever. It's when things happen that weren't fully anticipated, or they're the worst outcomes that were anticipated, because one thing's for sure, things never turn out in the most expected way, but of course they can be better or worse. So I think a lot will depend on, first of all, where we end up. Do we end up on the more pessimistic end? And if we do, then what are the policy responses? And I just think it's very hard to call. But I don't think that's, just because there's a lot of uncertainty, it doesn't make me a pessimist. If I believe, which I think I broadly do, that the policymakers that are going to be asked to make the tough decisions are going to be doing so in the right kind of way.
Okay. I have to ask this question before we top off. I'm just going to steal a few seconds. Does this mean that the new breed of economies and policymakers looking at economy cannot be in the image of yesteryears where it's a bunch of guys sitting in the dark room somewhere with cigars lit and trying to arrange interest rates or whatever, but they would now have to look maybe at non-traditional economic factors like culture and politics and governance to factor into everything that they're going to dish out for growth for the future?
Well, I mean, I think certainly when one is thinking about the broader questions of what drives long-run economic success, all the factors that you name are important. I don't think I want to say, though, that there isn't a role for traditional technocratic economic advice. Okay. And so if you look at, for example, monetary policy making, which is something I was involved in a few years ago, I still think broadly what you would do as a monetary policy maker would be the sort of more technocratic end of economics. That doesn't mean, though, that economists as a group oughtn't to be out there engaged in wider debates where a broader perspective that does take all the wider factors of politics and culture into account can't be useful in the way that we understand economic problems. So it a little bit depends on which area of policy you're talking about. But I do think that there's a role for sound economic analysis, at least, in trying to contribute to those debates.
Thank you so much, Professor Tim Beasley of LSE, for making time to be here. I have one last question, but I couldn't squeeze it in. That's about Malaysia being in the middle income trap, but I guess you have to come down again to Kuala Lumpur for us to discuss that. thanks to LSE Asia Forum 2014 for giving us this opportunity. Send in your own views through multiple platforms that we have at Astro Awani, from Instagram to Facebook, or even iOS and Android application on your mobile gadget. I'll see you in another episode very, very soon. Goodbye. Thank you so much.